Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's Light webinar about the EU environmental law, the implications for the lighting sector. A lot of legislation coming down the track, and today we're going to give you a bit of a heads up on that and how you can prepare for it. We have a stellar lineup of speakers as usual. We have Neil McLean, Industry Relations Manager at Lutron Electronics, and he'll be looking at the legislation side. And on the standard side, we'll be looking at Frank Thomas will do a deep dive into material standards and materials efficiency, and he is the compliance manager at ATG Airports. And we also have Nigel Harvey, the CEO of Ricolite, will be joining us for the panel discussion following the two presentations, and I'll be your chair for this morning. Neil is going to kick off and he is going to look at the regulatory reset for lighting, that it's more than efficiency. We're into all sorts of new stuff, circularity and right to repair and all that type of thing. And then Frank is going to follow that with an update of all the various material standards that affect the lighting industry and luminaires. And then we'll have a Q&A and we should finish. We won't finish later than 12:30, shall we say. Now, before we kick off the formal proceedings, a bit of housekeeping. We will be recording today, so you will get the full recording on email if you've registered for today. It will also be available on the Ricolite website, ricolite.co.uk webinars. So follow the links. And everybody who's on today will also get the slides on MailChimp, so you don't have to take notes or do screenshots as I used to do. Now, we welcome your questions and comments and observations. Please use the Q&A box for that, and that's the box that myself and the panelists will be looking at. And the chat box is for webinar admin questions. If you have any technical questions or any issues with a technical, my colleague Suzanne will be dealing with those, and she'll be monitoring that chat box. If you can't find those boxes, if you just mouse down to the toolbar at the bottom of Zoom, there's a button called More with 3 dots in it, and if you mouse over that, you should get the Q&A box and the chat box, and you can just drag them into your toolbar at the bottom so you can see them, and you can also have them as pop-outs as well. Now, today is one of a series of webinars that we've been running this year. In January, we looked at environmental product declarations, a user's guide to those, and we had 3 great speakers: Max Robson of Ricolite, Cale Gillum of Horley, and Teresa Kleber of Leadvance. And that is, like all of them that we've already done, you can go in and see the recording there and watch them at your leisure. There's a lot of great learnings in all of these. We did one on CAD-A lighting, the alternatives to the wasteful practice of CAD-A lighting. It was a joint webinar with the End CAD-A Lighting Waste campaign. We had John McRae of Orms, Paul Beale of 18 Circular, Hattie Emerson of the Finishes and Interior sector, and Tina Pallier of Circo Trade were on that one. And again, that recording is available. And then coming up down the track, we're going to EPDs again because it's such a big topic in this space, and understanding the value. And that is on the 7th of July, which is a Thursday at 11 o'clock as usual. And that is understanding the benefits and the value and why you would want an EPD. And our 2 speakers are Rachel Houlihan of Orms and Flavie Laurez of Ricolite. And then coming up in December is a new topic that we've never done before. It's about DC lighting networks, which are coming along on the continent, not so much in the UK. And we look at the sort of savings and the energy efficiencies you can get from a DC lighting network in buildings. And we have 2 great speakers, Ton van der Veel of Signify and Hartwig Stamberger of the Open DC Alliance. And all the webinars are free to join. You simply need to register at ricolite.co.uk and follow the links. Now we're doing a short survey this week about understanding the demand for EPDs. So it would be very, very grateful if you could take the time to fill this in. It's just to assess your awareness and your interests and your expectations of EPDs and how they can help your business. So when you get the slides, simply click on the link, which will be live on the PowerPoint, and it will take you to the survey, and that would be really helpful, and we're very appreciative of that. A reminder that you can see lots of stories and interviews about developments in the sustainable lighting space, stories about products, opinions, case studies, technology, lots and lots of stuff. It's all there on recolight.co.uk/news. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, where we have many, many followers. And you can also send news or any stories that you have that would be of interest to the wider community to me at ray.maloney@recolight.co.uk. And a name check for our flagship event, the Circular Lighting Live 2026. This year we are on the 8th of October at the Minster Building again in London. It was a very popular venue. This year we're looking at Vision 2040. What will the lighting industry look like if we rewire it to take into account true sustainability? So restructuring the lighting sector, Vision 2040 is our theme. I'd like to thank our headline sponsors, Fagerhult, Albus and Thorlux, for the support for getting behind sustainability in lighting. And the early bird booking rate for manufacturers ends on 31st of July. It's quite a substantial discount, so I would suggest get that note in your diary and get booked in. Lighting specifiers, M&E consultants, architects, go free. They need to register. It needs to be verified, etc. So you just need to go on there onto the website and just register and reserve your place. So that's it, 8th of October 2026. We shall see you all there. And I am going to hand over now to Ian to kick us off with the formal presentation. Ian. Or Neil, sorry. Sorry, Neil.
Hi, let me just hold on. Right.
I can see your opening screen. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Good. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Ray, thank you for this. My presentation, as it says here, is called the Regulatory Reset for Lighting. I'm going to talk a little bit about how EU laws that are and have been in development are reshaping lighting, not only across the water, but also over here. And then I'll try and also talk about some ideas that I have about how you might want to accommodate it. Anybody who's seen me present over the recent years will know that my employer makes me present this. So just a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm not a lawyer or a business consultant. Anything I say here today is I'm not giving any professional legal advice or opinion. And if you want that, then please reach out to your own legal counsel. So I'll also say a little bit about Lutron. So Lutron was started 65 years ago by a physicist called Joel Spira. He invented the first practical household dimmer switch and is credited because of that with starting the lighting controls industry. This product that you see in the image on the right, the old-fashioned image, called Capri Dimmer, that's on display in the Smithsonian Institute in the States, alongside products from people like Samuel Morse, Alexander Graham Bell, Thomas Edison. So significantly important inventions are on display in the Smithsonian, including Joel Spira's first dimmer switch. Since then, we've continued to be a leader in lighting controls, and alongside our kind of well-known lighting controls business, we also have a solar shading business, or an automated solar shading business. So we control not only electric light, but also daylight entering a space. And we've also been expanding into the lighting, so light sources and luminaires market, and including in the UK, where last year we acquired the Orluna business. The name Ketra's up there as well. It's an acquisition that Lutron made roughly 8 years ago over in the States, and both of those businesses focus on really kind of high light quality products, so quite a particular part of the market. A little bit about myself. I have clocked up more than 30 years of experience in the lighting industry now. Currently employed by Lutron as the person responsible for industry and government affairs in Europe, including the UK and Asia. A very big part of my time is spent in different industry associations. So I'm active and occasionally chair of various groups in the Lighting Europe, for example, the Lighting Industry Association in the UK, the British Blindness Shutter Association, the European Solar Shading Organization, ELCOMA, which is the Lighting Industry Association in India. And all of those groups, the common thread really of what I'm trying to do is to help make sure there's a good connection between industry and the regulators in those different product areas or geographical areas, to make sure that regulations that are getting developed are workable, practical, effective for industry and for the needs of the regulators and for the needs of our customers. Setting the scene. For many years, lighting regulation has focused almost exclusively from a sustainability perspective on efforts to reduce energy consumption, and we've been extremely effective in doing that. And it's an activity that the industry has been involved in for, I would say, 100 years. Regulations like the Energy Using Products Directive or the EUP Directive, I remember a long time ago, now known as eco-design, were responsible for banning incandescent, halogen, and even CFL lamps, which in their day were seen to be energy-saving alternatives to the sources that are available. And it's done that across the UK and Europe, trying to drive out poor energy efficiency products. So this is something that was the focus for a long time. Very effective, very successful piece of work that was done. And in the UK, not only did we have product regulation driving up energy efficiency and driving down energy consumption, but we also had the building regulation. So Part L has been effective as another tool in driving better energy performance from lighting in buildings in the UK. So although this continues, there's been a growing pushback on efficacy as the metric for rating the energy performance of lighting. So product performance regulation and Part L have really focused heavily on efficacy being the way to drive. So higher efficacy means lower energy consumption. One of the problems that we have with that now is that it's becoming more widely recognized that as we see LEDs and LED chips reach the limit of their efficacy capabilities, continuing down this road of ever higher minimum efficacy limits is actually driving down light quality and user functionality. This doesn't mean at all that lighting no longer has a role to play in driving down energy consumption. There's lots that can still be done. It's just that efficacy isn't the tool going forward, and that's increasingly being recognized. And so there is still much that can be done, much greater reductions that can be achieved through things like more and better use of lighting controls, better design, and so on. And we've seen, for example, Part L recently recognized this through the last update but one, where requirements for lighting controls for non-dwellings was added as one of the requirements, and being reinforced in the more recent update. So aside from energy saving, circularity, as Ray mentioned, has been making great strides in product regulation too. So the EU's eco-design product performance framework, so the traditional one that was the basis for the EUP regulations and so on, the framework regulation underneath which all the product specific vertical regulations like lighting and tumble dryers and all kinds of different things, that framework regulation has been replaced by a so-called Eco Design for Sustainable Products regulations, or ESPR for short. And where the old framework included some light touch circularity requirements like component removability and replaceability, ESPR goes much, much further by adding things like repairability, maintenance and refurbishment, upgradability, reusability, reliability, recyclability, recycled material content, and so on. I think off the top of my head, I think there's like 16 different kind of circularity related requirements in the new ESPR Eco Design framework. So although the timeline is far from clear, and at its soonest it will be several years away, the so-called single lighting Eco Design regulation will ultimately be replaced by a new version developed under the ESPR framework. There may be an intermediate step in between time when they still work with the old framework, but at some point there will be an update following this new framework, and therefore necessarily considering whichever are determined to be the appropriate circularity requirements that could be applied to lighting products. A typical approach in the EU is that they would start with regulations requiring disclosure of performance against those new requirements or against those new metrics, and then in later iterations of the regulation would actually look to set minimum performance limits. So you start with the disclosure. You need to understand and communicate how your products are performing against things like reusability. So there might, or repairability. There might be a repairability score. That's one of the tools that the EU has. Then you can anticipate that they would look to move to minimum performance requirements against repairability if that's determined to be one of the requirements. Lighting is one of the EU's identified priority product categories due to its electronics and materials content, its replacement cycles, and its waste and recyclability concerns. So there's every indication that this expansion to sustainability regulation through greater circularity requirements is a change that's here to stay. Let me just change slides. So this to some extent repeats what I've been saying. So why is it happening right now? Well, a couple of years ago, the EU, maybe even a little more than a couple of years ago, the EU Green Deal set out a series of initiatives that the authorities over there were obligated to implement through regulatory developments and other tools to refresh, including the refresh of product regulation and the eco-design product sustainability framework. So the EU Green Deal is driving a shift in sustainability regulation from simply how efficient is a product and how energy efficient is it, to start thinking about material efficiency and circularity. So how long does the product last and what happens to it at the end of its life become much more ingrained in regulation. That in turn is leading to the introduction of the regulation of circularity metrics like the ones I described, durability and repairability and so on. So what does this new regulatory landscape look like? Well, we can anticipate a move away from the traditional eco-design regulations, focused heavily on energy consumption, to a more broad sweeping approach that will include the ESPR circularity requirements I mentioned, plus other initiatives, including expanded sustainability information on energy labels. So there are proposals, and it's already been applied to smartphones and tablets and things like this, to expand the EU energy label that we're familiar with. It's now incorporated into UK law as well. So we have a very similar UK version of it, to not only look at the energy class of the product, is it A++, A+, by the way, that's all being phased out as well, but just A to G, I think, but to include other types of sustainability or particularly circularity related requirements. So there, you can expect, for example, that the energy label could include a repairability indication on it. So expanding beyond just the traditional energy class. As well as the energy labeling, digital product passports. I'll speak a little bit about those later. Revisions to circular economy and waste regulations, and far greater transparency and greater restrictions on the materials that are used to not only manufacture products, or the materials are not only in the products themselves, but the materials that are used in the production processes, all under ever greater scrutiny, obligations, and disclosure. So specifically looking at lighting, what can we expect? Well, for example, we might expect tougher requirements when it comes to things like the move from sealed for life or disposable products to more serviceable, repairable, and upgradable products. Some moves already were made in that direction in the last update, I think it was 2018, 2019, to the EU single lighting regulation. We can expect those requirements to be beefed up going forward. We might also expect far greater obligations on transparency associated with products, from things like substance content, component origin, repair instructions, repairability instructions, and the location of any critical raw materials that might exist in the product. As the EU, and not just the EU, generally as part of this move from globalization to much more regional approach to economy and infrastructure and manufacturing. Part of that is trying to avoid over-reliance on areas like China for as the only source for critical raw materials. So steps are being taken to help make sure that where these existing products, they can be collected and then put back in for reuse, following the kind of the circularity approach. The implications of these changes on the design of lighting products will include things like increasingly needing to design for component replaceability, non-destructive disassembly, greater awareness and control over the substances used in your products, and longer-term availability of spare parts. Today, a requirement that we don't have in the lighting eco-design regulations, but it does exist in other eco-design product regulations. So I said a little bit about digital product passports before. You may have been hearing more and more about these as time's gone on. Although they appear in various pieces of EU regulation, driven, including the battery regulation, there's a little bit on it in construction product regulations, but for us, the eco-design regulations look likely to drive it. So at whatever point lighting ultimately begins to follow the new ESPR framework instead of today's, or the historic eco-design framework, that's likely to bring obligations relating to digital product passports. So they are in development at the moment, and they will be a way of accessing any legally obligated data for products put onto the market in the EU. So any data that the law, the eco-design regulation in this case, says you need to communicate, you need to disclose. And I said earlier that that's a typical kind of progress route for development of regulations over there. You can expect the digital product passport to be the tool that's required to do this, or one of the tools that's required to do this. Typically, that data seems most likely to be accessed through QR codes. The actual vehicle is not fixed, but QR codes is the one that seems to be gaining most traction. And those QR codes might be expected to be required to appear in multiple places, including on the product itself, on its packaging, or at the point of sale. All of those are possible. The digital product passport, or the DPP, is expected to hold information relating to things like product composition, performance characteristics, repair and replacement information, sustainability and compliance information, and so on. It's expected that the information accessed via DPPs will be used by multiple stakeholders, including regulators, clients and specifiers, asset managers, recyclers, and regulatory enforcement authorities. And the reason I say on the slide, if applied to lighting, is because there are discussions about today's EPREL database possibly remaining as an alternative to digital product passports, where products are already required to populate the EPREL database over in Europe. if that turns out to be the case, then in the case of lighting, things like light sources and lamps may not be required to have digital product passports. But if at some point we see luminaires coming into eco-design, then since they aren't currently required to populate the April database, then we might see requirements still applying to our industry. So although everything I've been saying today is around what's going on over on the continent, excuse me, we've seen, I mean, this could change at any moment, but the recent communications, very strong indications, and I think indications are really maybe not the right word. The government's been quite explicit about its intention to align, for example, product law with EU law. So post Brexit, obviously there was the opportunity for the UK to go off and do its own thing. In our world, particularly relating to product law, there actually haven't been. People might disagree with me here, but I don't think there have been particularly big changes in terms of the product law that's applied in the UK compared to the product law that's applied in Europe. Maybe some exceptions relating to things like cybersecurity, maybe one, and substance restrictions perhaps. But generally, there has just been no changes to the UK law since the stuff that was applied when we were still part of the European Union. Current government wants that to remain the case. I think that can change at any moment depending on what government we have, and current Prime Minister has been very vocal about wanting to reset the relationship with the EU, including this alignment. Again, that could change at any moment. What else? One of the important benefits, I guess, if you're manufacturing for multiple markets, however, is that if you are aiming to be compliant with EU requirements, then as things stand, that seems to be a very good kind of indicator of the obligations that you can expect to be applied to in the UK as well. That's really the point that I want to make here. So acting early could turn investments in product compliance into market advantage for your businesses. So an early attention to preparing for anticipated regulatory developments could help manufacturers better plan for future redesign activities, so that the work gets done when it best suits you as a manufacturer, as opposed to when the law comes along and that's actually put into place, and you might have some fairly short notice period during which you have to get into action stations and prepare for compliance. So by being ahead of the market, manufacturers can become preferred suppliers also, strengthen specifier confidence, and even support new potential business models like service and maintenance contracts, product and system upgrades, and refurbishment and reuse solutions. So circular economy ready products and producers will increasingly win business from the ever-growing segments of the market that care most about those things. So what can you start doing already? Firstly, know what's in your products. I do quite a lot of presentations relating to bans on substances of concern, spend lots of time talking about PFAS. If you haven't heard of it, then you probably should. One piece of advice that I always try to give is that knowing what goes into every part of your products way more intimately than we ever did before is already becoming essential. If you haven't already, get in touch with your suppliers and start building up a strong substance level bill of materials for your products. This also helps you quickly understand any exposure that your business might have when the next revision to the REACH regulations or ROSH comes along. Knowing what's in your products and understanding what would happen if those are banned means that you're in a much better place should that happen. Secondly, review your current designs. What can you most easily do to improve the circularity of your existing products, and where's the low-hanging fruit? Thirdly, include circular economy principles into your design briefs, for example, by making durability or serviceability part of your design criteria. And finally, get close and stay close to regulatory developments via organizations like Recollite and your industry associations. I know that the LIA and Lighting Europe, for example, have great regulatory tracker tools, and like Recollite, spend a big part of their energy working for their members to influence regulators to design effective and workable regulation. So by being part of that discussion, you can help make sure that you're aware of it and you're shaping it. And this is picking up on the same point. So why does industry collaboration matter? Well, most importantly, there's a lot we're going to all need to do and going to need to all go through in the coming years, but none of us needs to go through it alone. Working with your industry peers means you learn from others about how to navigate these new challenges, and where necessary, can influence the regulators to fix any identified issues with the new laws before they become set in stone. This is very difficult to do as a lone manufacturer. Governments typically and the regulators typically don't want to talk with loan manufacturers, but talking via associations, whether that's Recollite or the industry associations like the LIA, can be a good tool to do that. Working together really helps. And finally, what are the key takeaways I would like you to take from this? Well, sustainability and circularity rules will reshape lighting products. The biggest impacts are already upstream in design decisions, and early strategic action reduces risk and can create opportunity. For much of what I've been saying, the question isn't really about whether these new requirements are coming. They're coming. It's a question of when and how prepared are you going to be to deal with them. And that was all I was going to say. I think I now pass on to Frank Thomas.
Thank you, Neil. Can people see my presentation?
Yeah, it looks fine.
Thanks so much indeed. First, I'll start with an apology. I'm now in a secure area, such that I can't turn my camera on, I'm afraid. But actually, for most of you, that will be good news, because to paraphrase one wit, I've got a great face for radio. So my name is Frank Thomas. I chair the BSI Committee GEL 111, which deals with the environmental standards for the electrotechnical environment to a large degree. I'm also liaison to CED 11, which looks after the material efficiency standards, which have been developed and are currently coming through. So I'm going to look at today at really trying to marry up standards to what Neil was talking about just a few moments ago. How are the standards developed that support the legislation? And also for us in the UK, how can we make use of the fact that although we no longer play a part in developing EU legislation, we are very active in the development of the EN, the European standards that support that legislation. So we're going to look at the standards, going to look at also sadly some of the barriers to the take-up of those standards, and touch on the legislation that Neil has mentioned, and then look at a potential risk, and that is the risk that we could see two sets of standards covering similar topics in material efficiency being developed in Europe, but also in the international arena under the IEC, which may or may not at this time be identical. So I'm going to be looking at standards and looking at some of the type of the standards and the topics that they cover, and you'll realise that when I do that, they very much marry up with the areas given on this EU view of what the circular economy actually exists of. So how do international standards work? Well, I've worked for United Utilities. They used to have their own set of standards, company standards. They're also pan-industry standards. I currently work in the aviation sector. That's very much the case here. There are national standards, British standards. There are regional standards, i.e. the European EN standards. And then finally, there's the IEC and ISO international standards. Now, it's often the case that, particularly in the UK, a national standard can be put forward into the international arena for them to become international standards. And the old BS 5750 was put forward and eventually became 9001, which is both an ISO and an EN, and consequently a British standard for quality management systems. Probably the most used standard in the world, I'd have guessed. So how do we adopt European standards in a post-Brexit world? Now, this is key. CEN, CENELEC and ETSI, the European standards bodies, they are not EU institutions. So when we left the European Union, the UK was permitted, under certain conditions, don't get me wrong, to remain members of those bodies. Now, what that means is when those organisations produce a European standard, an EN standard, as part of the rules of being a member of the bodies, one has to have a single standard system. So that means any conflicting or overlapping national standards have to be withdrawn and the European standard adopted. So the standards that will be developed to support the legislation that Neil was talking about will become British standards. And that limits the UK's options in terms of which standard they can develop themselves, or as I come to the end of my presentation, when I talk about the IEC standards, and which, if any of them, can be adopted. So I say the committee I chair is GEL 111, Electrotechnical Environment. So we develop the standards that work in the WEEE sector, substance analysis that Neil touched on, design for ease of end-of-life treatment. So how do you design a product such that when it gets to the end-of-life recyclers, it can be easily dismantled and treated? And also we've been looking recently at product category rules for life cycle assessments. Now, the other committee which I'm a liaison on on behalf of GEL 111 is CED 11, Material Efficiency Aspects for Products in the Scope of Eco-Design Legislation. Now, that provides the UK input into a joint CEN-CENELEC committee. CEN covers non-electrical matters, CENELEC covers electrotechnical matters, so CEN-CENELEC JTC 10. Now, they produced, at the moment, non-product specific, consequently horizontal standards. Forgive me if you know this already, but for those of you who don't, a horizontal standard is one that can be used across a whole range of products. A vertical standard is one which is designed to be used with a specific type of product. So, for example, a standard for a washing machine obviously is a vertical standard, but one which covered, say, machine guarding could be used across a whole host of machines. So that's a horizontal standard. So they've been looking at assessment methods, design rules, dematerialization, using less material, digitization, how you extend a product's lifetime so that a new product doesn't need to be bought, actually trying to do away with obsolescence or to a limited extent, how you can reuse or recycle materials or components. So these are the standards that CD 1-1 have currently adopted in the UK. As you can see there, apart from the top one, they've all got the EN prefix, so the European norms, but they've been adopted as BSENs. So I'm not going to read the titles out because I'd bore you, but you can see the subjects they cover: durability, remanufacture, repair, reuse and upgrade, recyclability and recoverability, proportion of reused components, proportion of recycled material content, critical raw materials, providing information for material efficiency, and circular designs. So they're out there, they're available. Here's the thing. Many bodies, including the JRC, have looked at this range of standards and compared them to, looked at how they could be used directly on specific product classes. And the feeling is only a small number of them could be used directly. For example, declarations of critical raw materials. But if we look at the 45554, which say looks at repair, that is far too horizontal at the moment for it to give full coverage for specific products. So I say it looks at extending product lifetimes. That's what these standards want to do. Assessing the ease of end-of-life treatments, assessing recyclability, recoverability. And to do that, it looks at accessibility, how easy a product is to disassemble if it needs to be repaired or refurbished. Also looking at, they don't want hobbyists, people who are members of the general public, attempting not so much complicated repairs, but obviously dangerous repairs, that they don't want the security and the safety of the product to be compromised. And there's also mathematical methodologies for calculating how the standard can be applied. There's a little bit of, I wouldn't say duplication, but in the eco-design regulations that Neil touched on, he mentioned the use of spare parts. Now, in many of those pieces of legislation, it lists which spare parts can be applied, put on the product by a member of the public like ourselves, and how many of them need to be applied by a qualified professional repairer. It also looks at the availability of those spare parts. So, for example, after a company or producers put a product on the market, that the last time they've done that, how long do they need to keep spare parts for? It can be for as long as 10 years, so that they can service products that are already out there on the market. And another thing that's coming through, and we saw them first in France, but other countries are keen, and the EU is repair and durability scoring. So the standards are looking going forward, are the ones that they're currently developing, how they can support that process. So take it with the standards. Now, there's a big difference here which needs to be understood. When Neil was talking about legislation, he was talking about documents which are legally, people are legally obliged to meet. However, standards are not mandatory. They support legislation. So for those of us who've been involved with electrical products for some time, we'll be familiar with the low voltage directive. Now, the low voltage directive does not contain many technical requirements in there per se. It is basically a general requirement of products to be safe. One needs to go to the product standards, such as EN 60335, to get the tests and the requirements to show how that product demonstrates compliance with the legislation. That standard's been cited in the official journal of the EU, so it becomes a harmonised standard and gives presumption of conformity with respect to the directive. However, the standards being produced by GEL 111 and CED 11, most of them do not fall within that category of being a harmonised or in the UK a designated standard. The one I can think of which does is EN 63000, which is for ROSH declarations. So companies can declare compliance with EN 63000 on their declaration of conformity for CE marking and for UK CA marking, UK marking. But said that's one of the very few standards which permits that. Now, the main problem was that these are horizontal standards, and when they were developed, the hope was that other product-specific committees, i.e., committees which develop standards specifically for defined products, would take up these standards and develop derivatives of them. That's been quite a slow process, I have to admit. So the only one I'm aware of is EN 45552 has been taken by Select TC59, which deals with domestic appliances, to look at developing a standard for washing machines on durability. So Neil touched on the ESPR. Are we likely to see with some of the regulatory developments that are taking place a greater take-up of the standards and the use of the standards? And the potential is there. You know, if there's a standardization request from the European Union to make these standards harmonized standards, give presumption of conformity, you know, that would go a long way to these standards being used by more producers. The only thing I would flag up, and it probably only, I'm talking anecdotally here, I must be honest with you, but over the last, say, 12 months or so, given the political discourse and the economic situation, are we likely to see, and I've used the phrase here, rowing back, probably deprioritization is probably a better phrase. Are we likely to see a deprioritization amongst regulators for developing legislation that will support the area of material efficiency? I very much hope that's not the case, but I think it's something we need to keep an eye on. It's certainly a risk. And then we move on to a risk which I touched on just a few moments ago, and that is the risk that we get standards produced in Europe that are not reproduced elsewhere. Now, I work for a producer and I work for several producers. Ideally, what we want when we see a standard is a standard that I can comply with, that will give me access to as many markets as possible. And we've seen this in the past between the IEC and Senelec, in that standards get produced either in Senelec or IEC, not normally IEC. For example, 60335 for electrical safety. They get developed there and they then get adopted in Europe. Now, there might be some European common modifications, we're quite familiar with them. But in the main, you've got a standard that you can work to. And where they are, there could be a difference. For example, in an IC standard I work with for electrical control systems, there was a case where one test was done at minus 25 degrees centigrade. In Europe, the Swedes said that wasn't good enough for their climate, and they wanted the test doing at minus 35 degrees centigrade. Well, actually, it didn't cause us a problem at all, because we could do one test at minus 35, cover ourselves for Europe, and we'd also have automatic read across for the IEC market, because we'd done a test that was harsher than what was specified in their standard. But, and I'm going to use because these IEC standards are on the way. I can't give a particular example, but the nightmare case is if a standard said, for example, one IEC standard said, you must paint that red, and the Sense standard said, you must paint that blue. Fellow Evertonians would be delighted, but we don't want to see a standard where to meet one and then mutually excluded from meeting another. So again, it's early days with this. We're not exactly sure how it's going to pan out. My preference would have been to have seen one set of standards, but where we are. So we are tracking the development of the IEC standards to make sure they don't differ to too great an extent from the IEC standards. So I'm hoping that my presentation will be circulated afterwards. If so, there's some useful links there looking at the standards which are currently published under JOL 111, and there are 49 of them at the moment. The standards that are under development, and there are 44, and CED 11, there's 10 of them, which I listed before, and there's another 4 currently on the way. Now, that brings me to the end of my presentation, so I'm going to stop sharing and hand back to Ray.
Thank you, Frank. And indeed, you're correct that that last slide with the links will be included in the slide pack, which goes out to all delegates probably later today. And at this point, I'll welcome Nigel to the panel. Welcome, Nigel. And Nigel, you've been working, following the government on its circular economy growth proposal. Can you tell us anything about that?
Yes, I really had hoped to be able to do a presentation on this today because there was a final version of the government circular economy growth plan, we believe, sent for right around, which is a formal government procedure, towards the end of last year by DEFRA. And that process is meant to allow every government department to have a view on it. My understanding is that it's stuck with Treasury and the Cabinet Office, but I can give a few heads up on what is likely to be in there that may may have an impact to those on the call. And they're likely to, the circular economy growth plan was intended to cover 6 different business areas, including electricals as one of those 6. And within the electrical stream, there's certainly, and it picks up from what Neil and Frank have talked about, a suggestion that there should be complete alignment between the UK and Europe as regards ROSH. And I think that would be widely supported by most manufacturers, as Frank said. You really just want one requirement to cover as many markets as possible. The growth plan's also likely to include more support for circular business models like leasing, finding ways of encouraging that to happen at greater scale. There was talk also from the other presentations about labelling, and there was certainly discussion about labelling on repairability or circularity indices being incorporated in the growth plan. I'm not sure whether they made the final cut. They may well not have done. Certainly talk about sustainable procurement by government, and so there may well be more government requirements on sustainability. So those who are involved in supplying government may well be needing to consider more of the issues that are not yet cast in stone in legislation, but are happening out there as we've already talked about. There'll be more guidance on repair and reuse. Interesting talking about PFAS. And this is more of an issue for Recollite, dealing with recyclers. There's likely to be more of a requirement for our recyclers to make sure that PFAS are removed during the recycling process. And that's going to be quite challenging. And for those who are aware of POPs, persistent organic pollutants, those became an issue for we recyclers probably about 5-6 years ago and had a significant increase in costs. Clearly, it was the right thing to do because POPs are horrendous materials that need to be taken out of the waste stream. And PFAS could be just as challenging to find ways of recovering them during the recycling process. The government is there are other areas that may be included in the growth plan, but there are two that DEFRA are currently looking at in some ways whether or not the growth plan gets published or in advance of the growth plan being published, and that is considering a ban on landfill of unused electrical stock. Now, we're not aware of that happening much at the moment at all, but if anyone is involved in doing that and actually thinks there's a good justification for landfilling rather than recycling, we'd love to hear from them because that seems to be something that is likely to move forward fairly quickly. And the other is providing charities with free collections of used electricals that they haven't been able to sell. And that makes a lot of sense to me. It just seems to help charities do the job of accepting used electricals, selling them on, but if they can't sell them, they become effectively waste. By giving them a free of charge collection, it makes it easier for them to do their charitable work and to encourage the reuse of products through through their charities. So that's a brief summary of what may be in the growth plan. And clearly, once we know what's in there, we will certainly be organising another webinar.
So you're expecting that this year, I take it? Who knows?
I mean, there is so much going on in government at the moment. It's difficult to say, but certainly it would be incredibly disappointing if it didn't come out this year. Absolutely.
Yeah, lots of good stuff. Lots of good stuff in that. It sounds like so good. Okay, right. We'll get the panel discussion going. If I could invite Neil and Frank to turn on your video. Not your video, Frank, but if you could just click your audio on and we'll know you're there. Let's start taking some of our questions. Paula Longato is saying, is there any regulation to where the QR code leads? Some QR codes already in products don't lead to information. They either lead to a broken links or to a general company website.
Exactly where it's going to lead, I think it's still up for discussion. There was a question about where it would have to be hosted. I saw one of the other questions I think that followed it, and I don't know whether that's a live discussion as well. So I think if I'm right, where it is at the moment is it seems most likely that there will be a requirement for the producer to hold the link or where the QR code goes to, and I think there was something in there about potentially backup or requiring like a backup for data to be held by a third party as well, to protect against the situation that the producer might go out of business. It will. So I honestly I don't know. It will be detailed for sure. That I can say. I'm sure that there will be quite clear requirements about where these links have got to go to, exactly which part of whether it will come in the eco-design. In our case, we're talking about the DPPs that are coming from eco-design, whether it come from the eco-design regulations themselves, or the kind of the secondary legislation that's been developed for digital passports. I don't know which it'll be. It's still very much in development, and in the case of lighting, several years away.
Okay, several years. We can't say more than that. Okay, that's always a question people want to know, isn't it? How long have we got?
It seems because if we if our next step in this, it's not known where it's going to go, but if the single lighting regulation, the eco-design regulation that we run on at the moment, was due to be refreshed at the end of 2024. That came and went without anything happening. Real work on refreshing it hasn't even started. There are lots of discussions about it going forward. But when that real work is done, if it's done under the banner of the ESPR regulation, the new framework, then that's a ton of work, because there's a whole lot of new stuff comes into it. We're talking about the circularity. So that's several years worth of work that needs to be done before it's then finalized. And then usually you get a period of maybe 18 months after it's finalized to become compliant. So the end of the decade, best case, seems about as good as it could be if they go down that full ESPR review.
It's interesting to see. I mean, 100 Fetter Lane, it's a 7-story building in the City of London. Everything in that building, it had digital product passports, including the lighting. So it's kind of, things are kind of happening. There's people going ahead. There's sort of voluntary sort of people going towards it.
But I don't know anything about that, but I assume it must be their own version of it, as opposed to the kind of the EU, because it's the EU is nowhere near finalized how a digital product passport has to look yet. So it's if they're doing something, they're doing their own version of it.
Correct. I think Waterman drew up a sort of a standard. They came up with a sort of concept. Correct. Yeah.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, and it exists, I think, so a version of it exists for batteries. So in the update to I mentioned this earlier, but in the update to the EU batteries regulation, they introduced a battery passport, which applies. It doesn't apply to most of the batteries that we use, but batteries for vehicles and things like that are required to have them. So some of the kind of the higher power, more meaty things.
Okay, there's a couple of questions about digital product passports. Gary Thornton is saying,
Ray, so just before we move on,
come on, jump in.
Yeah, just as an addendum to what Neil said, all very true. As an addition to that, looking at where we are now as opposed to where we could be with the DPP in the years ahead, the QR code on the energy label for applicable eco-design related products, that should link back to the PIS, the product information sheet on the EPRL database. So that's not going to be for all products, only for the specific ones covered by eco-design.
Okay. Gary Thornton is asking, a DPP seems like an obvious way to collate product data and hold it transparently in long term. Is the manufacturer responsible for hosting this information so that it remains accessible in years to come? Do you know who is leading the process and what the information fields within a DPP for a lighting product will include? There needs to be some commonality so it's useful and comparable. You kind of touched on this earlier.
I did, yeah. So I'd read Gary's question before. So where it's got to be hosted, I believe the balance is at the moment sitting in the producer field. So EPRL, the current kind of closest equivalent to it, is hosted by the European Commission. The digital product passport seems most likely that it will be required to be hosted by the producer and with a backup held by like an independent third party. I think that's where it seems to be sitting at the moment, but it's I believe it's still a live discussion.
And it'll be the standard format.
Sorry, Ray.
So go on, Nigel.
Okay, I was just going to add that I don't know whether Neil or Frank have heard them, but I've certainly heard mutterings of the possibility of the UK adopting digital product passports as well, and it would be very hard to imagine doing anything other than adopting the EU versions. The idea of having a little sort of our own little flag beside our own QR code, I don't think is going to happen. But the point was being made that actually it also helps recyclers and reuse operators to understand what is in the product and should therefore drive up reuse rates and also make recycling more effective if you have better information about what the product contains.
Yeah, so there could be, for example, it wouldn't so exactly what has to appear in the digital product passport for any particular product group is defined by the eco-design regulation for that product group. But you could imagine that it might include, if it was determined that lighting products had substances that needed to be separated at end of life, then you could imagine that would be a place to put it. So yeah.
And disassembly as well,
Yeah,
I
exactly.
guess.
Yeah.
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 Okay, Alex
Ray,
Ings. Oh, sorry, Frank.
again, sorry to interrupt. I've just put in the chat for people who are interested. There's an upcoming webinar hosted by CERELEC, the European Standards Body, on the DPP and the likely direction of travel. I got it by BSI, so I don't know if everybody who's not standard related can register, but the link is there if there is an open forum for people to join.
Okay, great, and that the link is in the chat.
In the chat.
Alex Ings is asking, how granular do
Sorry,
do
the link's in the chat, but that's just with us. I'll share it when I send out the email later today.
Oh,
okay?
right. Thank you, Suzanne.
Cheers, Frank.
Or you can pop it in the Q&A, Suzanne, maybe.
Yeah.
I can do that.
Okay. Bye.
Okay, great. Alex Ings is asking, how granular do DPPs go? Is the DPP required for each component within the luminaire?
So the DPP is linked to the eco-design regulation. So if there is an eco-design regulation, I don't see there being eco-design regulations for the components in the luminaire, but the just talking pragmatically, but the eco-design regulation for lighting may determine that the information relating to some of the components in the luminaire has to be included. So that would seem, again, it kind of ties back to what we were saying before. If for example, it was determined that luminaires had some, well, I mean, the other thing, of course, is luminaires are not currently in scope or they're not squarely in scope of the eco-design requirements, but that could change in the future, particularly because of the introduction of all these circularity requirements that seem, most likely suited to those. But in the event that happens, then the eco-design regulation would say this is the information that needs to be accessible through the digital product passport, and it will determine what the what level of granularity of detail needs to be provided, and that is where it's important that industry engages. So because the regulators will have their idea about what ought to be in there, and other NGOs might have their idea about what ought to be in there, and industry needs to be ready with, okay, this is what we think needs to be there. And I know that there is a task force already in place and working at Lighting Europe, trying to understand where digital product passports are, where they're going, and what Lighting Europe needs to be contributing to this discussion and prepared for.
I guess the big products are going to be the module and the driver would be the key ones, would it?
That would seem, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Dave Fear is asking, in respect of having to add QR codes to products, will this only apply to new products produced after a certain date, or will existing products in stock need to be retrofitted with QR codes?
Would seem really unlikely to be applied to existing products. It's not the way product regulation usually works. It normally applies. The regulation that you have to comply with is a regulation that's in place at the moment you put your product on the market. I mean, the moment you put the unit on the market, not the SKU type, or it's when that specific device enters the market, it needs to be compliant with any product law in place at the time. So anything that generally it's considered that product sitting in a wholesaler shelves or a retailer shelves is already on the market, so you don't need to make that comply. There have been some difficult cases where that's kind of not happened and it's fallen over, but yeah, looks like Nigel's going to say something.
I was going to add that there might be situations where product is being remanufactured, and after remanufacture, it is then placed on the market again. And at that moment, there might be requirements to comply with the legislation in force at the time, which might include digital product passports.
Yeah, go on, Frank.
Another possibility is, we saw it with energy labelling, didn't we? Whereby when the legislation came into place, there was then a transition period. I think it was about 18 months in some cases to run down inventory. Now, I say we're still early days with the DPP, so we're not 100% certain, but that possibility could be applied. But obviously, we don't know yet.
Yeah. That's also really normal. You get a transition period.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Bozina Erdman is asking, worth mentioning the EU obligation under ESPR to report on unsold consumer goods.
So the eco design, the ESPR framework regulation has very few obligations that are directly applicable to producers. Most of what it's about is kind of setting the scene for the development of the product specific regulations that are under it, whether it's for lighting products or for tumble dryers or for anything else. An exception to that is the ban on the destruction of unsold consumer goods. So I can't remember if it's already effective. I think it might be, given that the regulation was published already. I think a couple of years ago. One of the directly applicable requirements was that you couldn't so you couldn't destroy unsold consumer goods. I don't know a great deal about it, to be honest. Bozena might be able to fill in some gaps, but she's right that that's one of the requirements that was directly applicable to producers from ESPR. And I think it was heavily targeted at dealing with issues. Some of the online marketplaces had built up a reputation of kind of destroying unsold stock, and fast fashion is another really bad contributor to it, where unsold clothes and apparel were being set on fire. It's just try to stop this crazy stuff, but it doesn't. Although it may be aimed at that part of the market, it doesn't exclude other parts of the market. So, yeah.
But it's not lighting yet. It's not lighting yet, as I understand it.
No. You maybe know better than I do, actually. So,
yeah. This is also the driver that might be bringing it into the circular economy growth plan, in that, again, it was an online marketplace that I think back in 2019 or 2020, there was some fairly well covered press articles about wholesale destruction of brand new unsold product. And that is, I think, the main reason why DEFRA are now considering it for the UK. Sorry, Frank, you were going to say.
It's okay, Nigel, thank you. It's not my sector, but the last I heard with regard to textiles was that the ban was coming in against them being destroyed in July of this year.
That's right, on the textile industry. I mean, Nigel, you and I have seen this in action. It's quite shocking to see new products getting minced up. But there you go.
It's shameful.
It is, but it's in fact what one of the questioners earlier was Dave Fear from Donator Light, and they're doing a fantastic job of trying to make sure that unsold lighting products are actually passed back into use by charities and other such organizations.
Yeah, I mean, manufacturers would say, we don't want it to go in the grey market and come back. We've moved on to generation 3. Generation 2 is we sell it in Turkey, it comes back to the UK. So I think they would make that argument. Some of them, I would imagine. But
it's worth the word consumer is important in this as well. So it's consumer products that this applies to, and typically a consumer is deemed to be somebody who is using the product outside of their work. So if they're using it, in their life outside of their trade or their business, then it's typically considered to be a consumer product.
A question for you, I think, Frank, from an anonymous delegate. Is mass balancing a topic that CED 11 would consider in its scope?
It may not be mentioned specifically in its scope, Ray, but some of the standards I've seen coming through CED 11 do have mass balance as a method in there.
Do you want to explain what mass balancing is for anybody who's not familiar with it?
It's I won't say complicated, but there's a detailed methodology which looks at mass in to mass out. That's a very simple explanation, Ray, but it's the extent of my knowledge.
Okay, all right. Another anonymous observation question. If you have all this legislation in place, but not necessarily with the best materials, etc., is there legislation that informs specifiers and end users about what they should be buying and what they shouldn't be? It's kind of an education question, really.
Yeah.
I think the disclosure requirements are a big thing. So the fact that there is a big part of the regulatory developments are not just about the products performing better, but greater transparency on how the products perform versus relevant sustainability metrics. So that's become a really big. They call it consumer. I mean, it's the word consumer, but they call it consumer empowerment. The idea being that you empower the specifier or the purchaser to better understand what it is that they're actually buying or specifying. And that's so the labeling stuff we've been talking about, or the information that's available through the digital product passport, all of that helps people make an informed choice should they want to. The should they want to is a very big part of it, of course.
Bazina Erdman has come back just with a comment saying, for our information, there are also discussions to standardize DPPs beyond Europe to include both the US and China.
I had heard that the US had made noises about doing stuff as well with this. So that's thank you, Bazina, for the update.
Another anonymous delegate saying, anything I can send to my colleagues to drive this fact, finding it very hard to get through to people about designing for disassembly or to consider circularity at design stage.
Say come to Circular Lighting Live on the 8th of October.
Yeah.
That's exactly the type of issue that we seek to address, because actually getting to grip with all the circularity design issues is not straightforward, and learning from others and case studies about what they're doing and what works helps both manufacturers and specifiers to start taking this on board more fundamentally.
And we got a couple of specific questions on remanufacturing. Michael Emeka, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Do you have an idea how refurbed or reused product can be handled in terms of QR code, digital product passports, if at all? And Paula Lengato saying, complementing the question regarding certifications like CE. So I presume remanufacturers have to comply with all this stuff if you're putting a refurb product back on the market, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, if it's being placed on the market, I actually asked exactly this question of some people in which government department, BEIS or whatever BEIS are called now, and didn't get an entirely clear answer. But it does seem that on balance, it needs to products that are being remanufactured do need to comply with all the relevant legislation at the time. If it's not changed in any way, but it is being sold as a used product, it still needs to comply, but it may not need to be recertified as compliant, if you see what I mean.
It's quite a grey area. If you go in and upgrade, you go into an office, upgrade, take out the fluorescent, put in a LED gear tray. Do you have to stick a QR code on it, and do you have to have a digital product passport and all of that?
I know that there's a topic that's so it's recognised as a grey area, and both on the continent and in the UK, industry is working to try to bring some clarity to it. So I'm not sure. I know that papers are being developed. I'm not sure if they're released yet, but definitely work being done.
And it's good because actually we're seeing more of this happening, which is an encouraging step to be seeing.
Rosina Erdman is just clarifying a few things. The unsold consumer goods reporting is effective, with first reporting due this year, and reporting does apply to every consumer. It applies to consumer products under the ESPR scope, including lighting. But that might be as you say, on the consumer side. Michael Corrigan is asking, have you any details on that non-destruction of brand new unsold light bulbs that are compliant at the time placed on the market? Is there any guidelines or regulations? Bazina Erdman is saying there's a short section in ESPR and an implementing regulation defining the reporting template. To date, the only obligation is annual reporting.
And in the UK, that doesn't exist at all, unless the sort of consultation that DEFRA are running at the moment means that they do move forward with effectively a destruction stroke landfill ban, probably for consumer electricals.
And she adds the empowering consumers for green transition, regulating banned practices for green claims is an example of new regulatory requirement to be applied to products already placed in the market, and that's effective from September this year. Neil, all this legislation is coming down. Are we going to see a return to toolless replacement of back to a return of the lamp, effectively, where you can, LED modules are easily replaceable? Because that's a holy grail, isn't it, really, if we can make it easy for people to do that.
Honestly, I think the concept of the replaceability of potential points of failure is definitely going to exactly what's going to happen for LED modules and so on. I mean, it seems not reasonable to think that would be I think it's the idea that a component that might fail where possible should be replaceable is definitely.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of manufacturers are doing it now. They're bringing out modular downlights, modular fittings where you can chase. Yeah, on that. So
one of the things that I've kind of picked up on in dealing with circularity is like everything else, it's all super complicated. So so everything that seems really simple, generally when you dig into it, turns out not to be. And my general kind of preference on circularity is because there are so many. Circularity is kind of fundamentally aimed at reducing waste. It's aimed at material efficiency. So you need as little raw material in order to get whatever it is you're trying to achieve, and as little as possible is going into waste. But the way that's achieved, there are many different ways to achieve it. Whether you have products that are highly reliable and last a long time is a very traditional approach that the lighting industry have been, along with lots of other industries, have been providing products that provide ever longer and longer life for a long time, high reliability. That's a major contributor to circularity because it reduces waste. But it could also be using lighter, less dense, less material intense equipment can be a contributor to it. Repairability, upgrade. There's all different ways, and sometimes they can be counter to each other, unfortunately. So whilst improving one aspect of circularity, you may reduce another, and it makes the whole thing very complicated. And one of the things, for example, I remember I saw a very good presentation from I think it was from Trilux some years ago, where they had done some work with the EU Commission and identified that the extra equipment that was needed in order to make a failed product more easily repairable resulted in even although 1 in 100 products might fail early, every product had to have this additional componentry added, and that meant the net effect wasn't actually positive. And so I think it's a learning journey that Nigel spoke about. Circular Lighting Live, learning how people actually experience it, how they can deal with it, and still maintaining. I'm always nervous that this kind of regulatory push removes the different ways that the market, the industry can compete with each other, because we don't want. I think there should be multiple ways that the industry can react to improving the circularity and reducing waste, and we shouldn't be kind of driven down too specifically exactly which ones have to be used. And I think it allows different players in the market to do what they do in their own way while still achieving the same result that you have to. I'm not sure if what I said really made an awful lot of sense, but it did in my head at least. So
Yeah, I know what you're saying. Yeah, we still need that creativity, and manufacturers want differentiation, don't they? And they want a
yes,
story to tell.
yeah. We don't want to all be driven down the same route. So we want to maintain a healthy competition in industry and not let regulation drive that away, but still be appropriately helpful in making sure that we reach this goal of that we all want to do of reducing waste. And
I mean, I think Neil touched on quite an important point there. In fact, if we look at the lighting sector, we've made great strides in the longevity of products since the development and acceptance of LED lighting. In my own field of airfield ground lighting, tungsten halogen bulbs, or tungsten halogen lamps, were probably at 1,000 hours. LEDs were up at 30 to 50,000 hours. So much so that the FAA, which regulate in the US, they require all LED luminaires to have a warranty, including all electronics, of 4 years. So that there's great strides being made there.
Caroline Armstrong is asking, will digital product passports take into account industry-specific safety and compliance requirements when assessing sustainability? For example, in emergency lighting luminaires, fire-retardant plastics may negatively impact an environmental product declaration, but they are essential to meet the fire safety standards. Will DPP guidance include examples of good practice across different industries where safety, durability, and sustainability requirements need to be balanced? Great question.
I don't think that DPP will determine this. I think it will be the eco-design regulation will have to, the DPP is there to support. So the specific product vertical eco-design regulation will set the rules, and DPP is just a communication tool for the information that the regulation determines has to be communicated. So if the regulation says that you need to provide information on disassembly and locations of critical raw materials and so on, then DPP will do that. It's the regulation that will set the rules. And the regulation should take account of those potential challenges, like that certain materials are required in order to provide safety. And so although we may be moving into other types of regulations there, so eco-design, it's eco-design, potentially is going to have substances of concern requirements in it as well, so which it hadn't done in the past. But the regulation should take account of it, and that again comes back to if you see a risk that your maybe edge case is not going to be picked up by the regulation, then get involved with your industry associations and engage and make sure that your needs are understood. Because if you don't, there is a risk that people like me were sitting there thinking we know it all, miss it, and we and you get a regulation that actually causes more problems than it solves. So so absolutely get involved.
And Frank, you'd echo that, I'd suggest.
Oh, very much so. The other thing I'd flag up there, and it goes back a few years to when I was working in a different role, there was some concern at that time being expressed that the Green Claims Directive, that at that time was still in the planning stage, may limit the amount of environmental claims that a producer could make if they fell down in one particular area. For example, if there was a substance under the CLP regulations for chemicals, if any of those items where substances were in the product, it could limit the company from making claims regarding the energy efficiency or the life expectancy of the product. Now, I say I've moved on from that role, so I'm not sure how that panned out, but that was still it was quite a major concern about 3 or 4 years ago.
I think it was dropped. So you're right. It was highlighted, and this idea that you couldn't claim a product to be sustainable if it had substances of concern, and it was dropped, I believe.
Yeah. Because the concern then was this substance was actually legal to use. However, because it was on the CLP list, it could restrict your green claims. So I'm pleased that was dropped.
But it's just another example of how complex the whole thing is. So Yeah, it's whilst something, and somebody put it in the chat, I think as well, the idea that the there are other things to consider as well, and whilst use of PFAS is a good example. So PFAS, called forever chemicals, they're exceptionally popular because they do fantastic things to the performance and the life of the products that are manufactured. And that fits very well into circular principles. You make things reliable and last a long time and brilliant. But the fact then that this chemical never goes away, and it accumulates in the planet, and that we have it in our water, and we have it in our bodies, and we have it in the most isolated parts of the planet, and that it contributes to climate change, all of these negative things that are recognized as well. Yeah, it's these stories are painfully complex.
They are, and if we are required to remove PFAS, which is clearly makes sense, but from the materials being recovered through the recycling process, what that often means is actually you've got to go through a destruction process. And so, for example, plastics that might get contaminated with PFAS then cannot be reused in the circular economy. And so there is a real challenge in legislating for substances that are clearly of huge concern, and a tension between that and the desire to adopt more circular economy principles and to be reusing more materials and products and sub-assemblies.
Okay, a final question is, how will all this stop wholesalers that buy cheap product from China that complies with the legislation but still is a poor quality product?
When he says poor quality, does he mean from a compliance standpoint or a performance standpoint?
He doesn't say, but I'm guessing it just ticks the boxes basically,
Yeah.
but is still a poor quality product.
Then
it comes. Go on, Neil.
Yeah, I just got to say that it's where you draw the line between what the law requires and what it doesn't. And if the law does allow a certain lower quality as well as the top quality, and otherwise, if it's about non-compliance with the law, that's a different story. And there's a lot of non-compliance with the law because enforcement is underfunded, but digital product passports are intended to help with non-compliance as well, or they're intended to make it a little bit easier.
Yeah, I mean, assuming the question is meaning from a compliance standpoint, I mean, the key thing is enforcement. As we've all know, trading standards, market surveillance authorities, they're underfunded, that they have been since the financial crisis, probably even before then. And you have all these standards, all these regulations in the world, but there's no enforcement. It's a significant issue for producers like mine and Neil's who are meeting all these regulations and being undercut by free riders. Sorry, one for one.
Nigel, there's been some activity on the online selling front, hasn't there?
Well, there has. I mean, I saw a report of some mystery shopping that I think Lighting Europe did associated with testing, and it made my blood run cold. The proportion of products that were non-compliant was, north of 90%, I think, wasn't it?
These were
that they
emergency
discovered.
lighting products. So
Exactly. And that is very disturbing to hear. And actually, whenever any of us are talking to any government department, talking about the need for better enforcement is at the heart of everything, because actually it doesn't matter how many good regulations we bring in. If they're not enforced, then the law becomes an ass. In the we sector, we have had some success actually, and online marketplaces are now legally required to report the products sold via their platforms and to be compliant for we, and that means they're getting some we costs in 2026 and a full year of we costs in 2027, which means at last they are paying their fair share of we costs, and that compliant companies are no longer sort of almost subsidizing the non-compliant operators selling through online marketplaces.
And that's attributed to a lot of the lobbying that you and others have did on that front. You're too modest to mention it, but there was a lot of lobbying went on behind the scenes to achieve that. So congratulations to all of that. Right, we've come to the half hour, so I'm going to wrap up there. We've covered all our questions. The slides will go out probably later today. The recording will be around tomorrow. If you could, a reminder, if you get a chance when you get the slides to click on the link to our short survey on EPDs. And speaking of EPDs, our next webinar will be on Thursday, the 7th of July at 11 o'clock, and it's a dive into the benefits of EPDs. It just remains for me to thank our excellent speakers today for giving their time and their knowledge and their insights today, Nigel, Neil, and Frank. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
And if
You're
I could
welcome.
just say thank you to Neil and Frank as well. I've worked alongside you in various committees for probably well over a decade, and I really value the expertise that you've brought to the session today. Thanks to Ray for chairing in such an effective way, and to Suzanne for driving everything at the back end of the operation. Thank you.
Great. See you
Thanks,
all
everyone.
on the
Bye
7th
now.
of July. Bye bye.
Bye.